All right, so after this conflict with the Ottoman Empire, Russia needed allies. So, Peter and his diplomats went on an embassy to foreign European powers in an attempt to secure alliances and information on their new foe, this foe being the Ottoman Empire. However, he didn't want to deal with the formalities of the king visiting, right? Foreign powers would try to hide information if they knew that he was the king. So he went in disguise. Now, this is pretty difficult for a person who is 6'10", but he did give it a good go. From this grand embassy, Peter would gather information on how other European countries worked and would later try to remodel Russia in that image. But he was unable to secure any alliances, and his trip was cut short due to rebellions back in Russia. But this did start his social reforms. Before his reign, Russia was a deeply religious and spiritual society, right? It was unlike the rest of Europe, which at this time was going through the scientific revolution and secularism. Well, after this grand embassy, Peter issued a great deal of social reforms, right? Education reform for the nobles. He rejected the traditional role as the Christian Orthodox king and head of the church, and he called upon secular and utilitarian ideas to basically refashion himself as a servant of the common good who worked for the glory and honor of the Russian fatherland, a more nationalistic movement instead of a religious one. So his main attempt was to create what was known as a well-ordered state, or a state that resembled more like most other European powers, right? This involves some simple rules, right? He needed to establish a taxation system. He wanted greater control over the territories and society, consolidating his power. He wanted integration into state through obligatory service. Basically, the nobility first and foremost, trying to integrate them into politics and the government. Non-nobles were offered a chance to reach nobility through civil services. This was extremely interesting because it's a chance to rise up to that noble status through effort, which is something we don't really see until Napoleon's time. But he did issue one rule. Nobles were forced to shave their beards. While this may seem arbitrary to people in modern times, this was Russia. This was a very religious and traditional state. The beards were a tradition for them. So to have them shave really just shows the power that Peter would possess after these reforms. But all in all, with these reforms in place, he had effectively modernized Russians' social life and made it more like the rest of Europe. But this wasn't the only thing he did. During his reign, he would have to deal with what was known as the Great Northern War. Charles VII of Sweden would fight against Peter the Great. The Swedes had a well-trained army capable of being a European great power. The Russians, well, they were anything but trained. However, this conflict would decide which power would become the great power in the Northeast. Which power held on to this foothold of the Baltic Sea? Had Sweden won the war, they would have been the major competitor in the north. However, they lost the war, and Russia was left victorious.